Reamer. I am the creative director at Rose Digital. Rose Digital is a small minority Black-owned agency. And we basically have done one of these Black History AR experiences every year for the past, I think, 4 years. So really excited to work on this one. And this was a great experience working with Niantic Studio and the team here. I'll pass it to Declan first to introduce himself, and then Jordan, who will then lead us into talking about design.
Cool. Thank you, Nicole. Nice to meet you guys. I'm Declan Johnson. I'm an independent developer. I've been working in studio now for probably around 6 or 7 months, and just love the platform and was super excited for the opportunity to help out with this. I got to go up and actually scan the sites, talk to the people there, and then had the opportunity to help bring this project to life as well. So it was a lot of fun and very appreciative for Rose for allowing me to help out with this and help build this awesome experience and share these stories.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. My name's Jordan Johnson, unrelated to Declan. Um, I am an art director, mainly focused on immersive tech experiences, and worked with Nicole on the creative and art direction for this project, which was really exciting. So we'll be walking you through kind of our process creating this experience. I'll start off going through the design phase and then hand it back over to Declan to talk more about the development phase. So I think we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so to quickly go over the experience, as Pablo mentioned, we partnered with Niantic to create this interactive project to allow users to explore historic Black Wall Street and the landmarks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, celebrating Black History Month and allowing users to learn more about Black Wall Street, really leveraging the Gaussian splats to make this really immersive and educational experience. So the locations were captured using Scaniverse, and we then layered historical images into that 3D environment to allow users to directly kind of compare the past and present through AR. So before diving into the design phase, I think we have the video on the next slide, and that will just give you kind of a quick look at how the experience works. Awesome. Okay, hopefully that video worked. I know sometimes video can be hard to view over virtual meetings, but as you can see, the experience kind of transports users to Tulsa, where they can then interact with 3 key landmarks, view the historical photo overlays, and engage with the history of Black Wall Street. So from a design standpoint, our goal was to really ensure that all of the elements like the Gaussian splats, the historical images, and the UI really worked together seamlessly. So balancing those elements while keeping the focus on the historical images and storytelling and kind of main visual components being the splats and the images. So making sure we were designing a really clean and intuitive experience. We can go on to the next slide. So for the art direction, we drew inspiration from civil rights poster prints, that kind of newspaper print layout design, which uses really bold type, kind of strong compositions, and kind of simple layouts. Since this experience is very image driven, we also took inspiration from camera lenses and that kind of circular shape to create the portal or the door that would transport users in the experience. We wanted the elements and the UI to complement the historical imagery without kind of overwhelming it, ensuring that the splats and the historical photos remained the focal points. So we explored 3 different kind of design directions with that in mind, which you can see here through the start screens, and we carried those designs throughout the other screens for each iteration. So the first being a more text-heavy approach that treated the title and the info as kind of bold headlines. The second is more image-focused, integrating that text information as an overlay. And the third was kind of a mix between the two, so a hybrid approach combining both the text and the imagery together. And on the next slide, we'll get into the splats. So in this initial design phase, we got to dive into the studio to kind of examine the splats and preview what was captured. Since the splats, of course, were generated from the real world scans, they included some unneeded elements like floating branches or kind of disconnected ground areas, just unnecessary parts of the surroundings. So we were able to kind of view that in Studio, took screenshots, marked up the areas to crop out, just making sure that the final splats were cleaned up and focused on those key areas relevant to the historical sites themselves. So going into the next slide. For the initial designs, you'll see a few of these initial design screens taking on that second style approach with the overlay text, which also aligned with kind of the function of the historical images overlaid as well. So as users entered the experience, they would go through the circular portal, which mimicked a lens, again, connecting to the idea of kind of a new perspective and tying into the photographs. Once users entered, they were immersed in the splat where they could interact with the image overlays and read more on the history of the site. Initially, we designed an opacity slider. So once users were immersed in the splats at each landmark, the image would fade in front of the splat in that 3D space. And with the slider, users could adjust the opacity of those overlays, creating a really kind of interactive way to fade between the past and the present. Moving on to the next slide. When we did start development, though, we ran into an issue when implementing that slider. So we discovered that the image planes, kind of with any opacity that was below 100%, essentially caused rendering issues with the layers in the 3D space. So it would cut into the object behind them, making a hole in the splat itself, which you can kind of see on the video here. So to fix this, we shifted from a slider to a toggle system. So instead of adjusting the opacity, users could now tap to show or hide the photo overlay. So still maintaining kind of the full render of the splats while also providing that intended before and after comparison for users to be kind of fully immersed in present day Tulsa and then also see the historical Black Wall Street. So going into the next slide for the final designs, here are a few screenshots of those with the toggle feature in place. We updated the copy to reflect those changes, really keeping the design simple and intuitive, making sure the focal points, again, were the splats and the photographs to really lead this exploration. So that is kind of the design phase, and I'll hand it over to Declan to walk you through the development side.
Awesome. Thank you. So in the engineering phase, typically one of the things that I really try to do is use a past sample project. So use something that already exists from other developers and from the team at Niantic. Build a new mechanic, which in this project, the cursor tap to place functionality hadn't been built for Studio yet. It has been built and used many times in the 8th Wall Cloud Editor, but it hadn't been available yet in the studio. So I ended up building that, and then leveraging new studio functionality is something else that I try and do pretty regularly. And right as we were working on this project, Niantic actually announced the Spaces functionality being available. So I was able to kind of add that into the project as well to show that you can use Spaces in a way to kind of organize the different scenes of the project. So if you want to click on the next slide. So I wanted to kind of show you guys where these are located and what they did. And I'm gonna go through and actually go and dive into the code after we get through these slides and show you where some of this stuff is. But if you go to the project library at the top of Niantic's website, of Eighth Wall's website, you can go and find this splash screen sample project. And that was actually where I started for this project. I always start a project cloning another project. That is just something I've always done. I've been working in Eighth Wall for about 4 years now, and every single time I start a project, I clone another project. I'd never start from scratch. So I started with this splash screen because, I feel like kind of industry standard is having a good place for people to land when they get to the experience. And we wanted to create something that was something we were used to, which is the loading screen inside of Eighth Wall cloud editor projects. That actually isn't featured inside of Studio. There is no like spinning loader at the beginning of um, the Niantic Studio project. So we recreated the one that's inside of the cloud editor projects, which is this middle image right here. And then after we loaded in all of the assets, we went ahead and jumped into the welcome page of the experience, which is still technically part of that same splash screen script. So we'll dive into that script in a little bit, but that was one of the parts that I ended up cloning and reusing and using from the actual sample projects that are available. So if you go to the next one. And then the part that I ended up building from scratch for this, luckily I had already been working on it because it was something I wanted in Studio anyway, but this cursor tap to place is a functionality that I've used a lot in my career that just didn't exist yet. So I ended up building it and implementing it here inside of this project just as like the main mechanic for placing down the portal and for being able to begin the augmented reality experience. So I've actually gone in and made that publicly available. All the projects that I work on, I try and make part of the code publicly available for people to access. And you can view the community sample projects by going to the project library. And then on that right drop-down menu, there's a community projects tab. And I can show you it a little bit better when we're on that site. But if you click on that, it'll show all the projects that are created by community members and are open source for anybody to use when they're creating their own studio projects. And then if you go to the next one. And then I just wanted to show in the documentation where spaces are located. So spaces were used to transition from kind of the tap to place scene to the first Gaussian splat scene. And then, the second Gaussian splats being screen was its own space. And then the third was its own space as well. And we'll dive in again into spaces a little bit, but spaces are like scenes inside of any game editor, kind of like Unity, where you have kind of a segregated area to build out a specific scene, and then you can transition from one to the other without having all of the extra data and information there, unless you want it to be. And I'll show you guys how to kind of set what information you want to travel from scene to scene or from space to space as you move from space to space. So I think that's it for the slides. And if everybody is down for it, I'm going to share my screen. And let's go ahead and start jumping into, let's see, let me just share this entire window. Okay. So now you can jump into here. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yep.
Okay. So, just to kind of, I guess, start off, let me jump into this project library. So you just go to the eighthwall.com project library, And then here are all of the projects that you can clone straight off the bat. Again, I always use one. This splash screen one is the one that I used for this project. And then if you want to see the community ones, you just go to this drop down over here and hit community projects. And all of these are open source projects that you have access to clone. And it's all free. It's all just people like me in the community that want to share the information and share the scripts that we've been writing to help other people have a head start. So the one that I used and created, I guess, for this project is this cursor tap to place. So again, that's just where to access those. And in the documentation, you go to the documentation and then Studio. And that's the only documentation that we're going to be working with. The other stuff is for Cloud Editor, which we're not going to cover in this project, but you want to make sure you're in the correct documentation because it can get confusing if you're not. But Spaces is what we'll be talking about in the documentation. So it was just recently added, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's still really, really new. And I know the team works really hard on documentation. So anytime I can plug it, I always try and make sure I send people this way. But let's dive into, let me move this real fast. Okay, let's dive into the splash screen first. So this was made by George, who's not here today. George is one of the developer support engineers over at Eighth Ball, and it's an awesome project. Like I said, industry standard right now, and kind of for as long as I've been working on Eighth Ball is having a nice landing page, making sure that you're loading in all the assets before you show people the project. So this sample project right here does that for us. It uses the state machine, which honestly is probably the heaviest lifting part of all of the scripts that I currently write inside of Studio. I use the state machine for everything. And even if it's just a single state, I would much rather use the state machine than the add, just because you can have problems with add, but state machine like resets itself really well when you're swapping from space to space. So in this one, what it's doing is grabbing the assets and then getting the statistics for if the assets are loaded in or not. And then once the assets are loaded in, it's basically just like triggering to the next frame. So it's removing the frame that is being shown. It's setting this progress text to completed. So you'll see like a little 0 to 100%, depending on how loaded the assets are, and then it'll swap over and say that whatever you set as the progress text is done. So we can see that here. So progress stress is progress, and then it'll say tap to begin. You tap the screen and it'll remove the UI and you'll jump into the experience. I used that, like I said, but I actually manipulated it a lot. We can see here how I like to go in and manipulate some of these texts. So we have the same structure. We have some stuff in the ad, and this is how I did the UI. It's not really what we're going to focus on today, but just know that I injected HTML into the scenes to get the UI working properly. But we're going to focus on the stuff here inside of this state machine. So we have the loading state and the onboarding state. So I actually added in an extra state into the state machine, which wasn't initially in this. I guess, no, there is the loading and onboarding and experience ready. So I did use all of those same states. So loading is the same. It has a different background and look to it, though. The loading state is actually that black background with the little spinner on there. That's just all done with HTML and CSS, that spinner. And then just to make it not flash on for a second and then immediately flash off, I actually set a timeout of 4 seconds. So it sits in that loading state a little bit longer than it needs to before it transitions into the onboarding state of the project, just because it can be kind of confusing for users to immediately flash onto one screen and then flash to the other without them seeing it. So if it is a really fast load like this project was, because the assets were really optimized, I tend to go in and add just a little bit of extra time for the user experience of it. And then when we get into this onboarding state, I'm using this on enter method inside of our state machine to hide all of the old UI and then bring up all of the new UI and functionality. All of my event listeners are inside of this enter. If it is like a UI event listener, like you would do in HTML and CSS, so like the click event listener is added into this on enter, and then on exit, I am removing it, so we're not listening for that anymore. Then like the state transitions, we have this on trigger. So on trigger is a way to transition from one state to another without having an event listener. So like with this, you click on the screen and then it triggers the to onboarding trigger, which then moves us from the loading to onboarding. And then this one right here is the same experience ready that takes us from onboarding into experience ready. And when we're in experience ready, which is this state right here, we are hiding the splash screen entirely, so it's not there anymore. So that's kind of how this script is working. Again, it's the same exact script that George made. I just went in and styled it a little bit differently. So again, I recommend highly for people to just use the tools that they're given and copy and clone as many of these sample projects as you can. When you're starting out with one sample project, it's really easy to clone it and jump into a project with it. When you are adding a sample project into a project that you already have, you have to copy all of the scripts over correctly and make sure that you are applying them. So my rule of thumb is the sample project that I want to use that has the most scripts is the one that I clone the project from. That way I don't have to copy over as many. And I kind of have an idea of which sample projects I want to clone for the end result before I start a project. So like I'm working on a project right now that I'm using a community sample project for, which is a gyroscope project using your phone. But I'm also using like the splash screen and a couple of other different sample projects. So I went through, have proven out each individual part of the project using just the sample project clones. And then now I have a list of exactly what I want to use. And then I'll create my project from the one that has the most scripts. That way I don't have to copy and paste and, fix everything as much. But then the other sample project that you guys can now use is this cursor tap to place that I made. And I try and write my scripts and components to be as easy to use as possible. So this only has one script in it. You just copy this. I'll kind of walk you through how it works. But essentially, if you look at our scene right here, we have a cursor container and a placement container, and then we have ground. So those are the three most important things that this script is using. If we go into the cursor container, or no, where is it? On the camera, sorry. The camera is actually where I have this script connected to in the hierarchy right here. So we can look at all of the different like schema variables that I have shown right here. You can run this entire script from this cursor tap to place component on the entity of the camera. Like you don't have to dive into the code at all to use this component that I built. I didn't want people to have to jump into the code if they don't want to. So what you essentially need to do is copy this over, place it in, and then put it on your camera. So if I was starting from scratch, I'll just remove that. So I have the camera. I would copy over this cursor tap to place, paste it in, and then go to custom components and hit cursor tap to place. So now we have a bunch of options here. You have your cursor entity, your ground entity, your placed entity, the Y height of the cursor. That's just offsetting it a little bit so that it's not even with the ground plane, which can cause plane fighting, kind of like the planes going in and out from each other, kind of flashing and stuff. So I always offset it a little bit in the Y to make it so it's a little bit above the invisible plane. And then a couple of other fun functionalities that I added in here just for style. So if I was to do this project and I had this entity I wanted as a cursor, I would go in here and hit, or I would actually go into the cursor container, which is holding everything right now, and I grab it and drag it onto the cursor entity. I have my ground entity right here, and then my placement container, which is my placed entity. So your cursor is visible at the start of the project. That's what's kind of following your camera around when you're looking at the ground and moving around. The ground is just an invisible plane that is our 0 for the scene. And then the placement entity is invisible at the beginning, and that is what we will be placing into the scene. And I can go in here and put this as like 0.01, the Y height. So if we just run this right now, we can build it and run it. Let's see. So you can see they're both hidden right now. That's something I should mention. Both of these are hidden. So you can't see them in the scene. But when we start the experience, the cursor entity is shown. That's part of the script that I'm doing. So it's when we enter this active state right here, we are removing the hidden from, there we go. We're removing hidden from the cursor entity. So as soon as we go active with our state machine, this is now visible. So you can see this little square is my cursor. And then as soon as I tap, oh, maybe. Oh, okay. I know what's happening. Let's make this 1. Sorry about that. I have this set to 0 so that we can grow it. But it did appear. It's just 0 scale, so we didn't see it. So let me rebuild it really fast. Okay, so we have our little square here. Tap it, and now we have our circle that appeared where the square was. If we moved our camera around, you would see that like the square is moving with the scene, moving with the camera where the camera's pointing. But so that's basically a cursor tap to place. I added in this grow on place, which I think is fun. It's a good way to add a little bit of extra to like a tap to place project. So let's make this scale back to 0, and then let's turn on this grow on place. So we have the grow speed, how fast it's going to grow, the final scale that we want the object to be when it is fully grown. For here, we're just doing 1, and then we have the easing functions. So I'm not going to explain easing like in depth, but it's essentially just if it moves quicker at the beginning and then quicker at the end, or just how well it transitions from that value of the starting value to the final scale value. So let's build it again. Now that we have grow on place enabled, we should see that we place the square and then the ball slowly grows out of where the square was located on the ground. So, okay, we have our square, it's tracking. You can see it's moving around as the user's kind of swaying back and forth. We place it, and now it grows. And it's staying locked to that anchor. So that is the functionality of this script. Again, let me walk through just the actual code very quickly. I really try, and you can see here, I add in probably too many comments, trying to make this super readable for everybody that jumps into it. And again, my intention for this is to make it so cursor tap to place can be used without any editing of the code at all. I don't want people that aren't trying to, or that aren't programmers, but want to use this. I don't want them to have a barrier. So it's for designers and stuff, or especially that just want to show something in a nice way with tap to place. But what we are doing inside of this script, so we have our state machine, and then we have our first state, which is our initial state, called active. When we enter active, we are making the square visible. And when we leave active, we are setting it back to being invisible. So on tick, this is something that is really nice in Studio that we can use. Inside of each state, we can have our own tick, which, I mean, tick is basically like when your camera's frame updates, it's calling the tick function. So every single time our frame updates on screen, we're getting this tick running. And it's only active when this state is active, which I love. It helps me so much when I'm writing code inside of Studio to have on tick as a method of the actual state machine. So what we're doing is we're grabbing the ray cast. So it's shooting an invisible line in the center of the camera. And when that intersects with the ground, we are placing the square in that little area where we're intersecting with the ground. So that's what this raycaster is doing and this ground object. And then if we have a ground object, it's looking for the intersects of the raycaster and the ground object. And then we have the length. So it gets the intersection point right here. And then this smoothing right here makes it so if you like jerk your phone around really fast, it's kind of like smoothly moving the cursor instead of it just kind of jerking around with the camera too. So this is just kind of a, I don't know, like a user experience or like a nice to have. You don't necessarily need this part of the code, but it does make it look a little bit smoother as you're placing the cursor. And then it is updating the position of the cursor entity right here. Now, and then we're using actually the look at animation function to have the object, the cursor, let me pull it up again, look at the user. So if you rotated around in a bunch of, like in 180 degrees, this flat line of the square would still be facing you. You have to have it so that that cursor is constantly looking in the direction of the user. So right now it's looking at the camera's position in the X and Z axis. Basically, it's not using Y, so it's not like looking down at where the camera is. It's only looking on the Z plane, or sorry, on the Y plane at where the user is located. So it's rotating around the Y axis, looking at the user. That's just kind of another thing that's nice to have. And then it's listening for us to tap on the screen. Once we tap on the screen, we are actually going to save the position of that cursor. And then we are going to trigger the transition into our next state. And then this on trigger is essentially us like saying, once we have this place object triggered, let's go into the placed state. So now once we're on the placed state, we enter it, we get the final positions. So right here, we're saving these as data attributes, which are up here. This is data that we can use throughout the entire script. So we're saving that data here. And then because we have to save it to be able to access it in another state. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't be able to access this data in the next state that we go into. So now we can access this data. We're in the placed script. And then we can use the set position method to set the placed entity in the position where the cursor was when we tapped the screen. We can use the look at one more time to get that to face us as well. And then we remove hidden, so we make it visible. And then we use the scale animation. So I gave it a little bit of a timeout to make sure that we make it visible before we start the scale up. So it has like a 200 millisecond, so 0.2 seconds of a timeout before we start the scale animation. And that's just to make sure that it is actually visible and that we're good to go. Then we have the scale up from 0. So right now it's invisible and it's at a 0, or it's visible, but it's at a 0 scale. And then we scale up to the final scale that we have set in this component right here. So that is how this script is working. Again, please use it anytime that you want. It is open source, so you can copy it and paste it into your project. Hopefully that was a good enough walkthrough of how to use it. It's really simple to use, and I really want people to use it. And it's a big part of this project. But lastly, we only have a couple more minutes, so I think we have 3 minutes. So let's look at Spaces really fast. Spaces is a really nice thing that Niantic added in. This is our project right here for Black Wall Street. We have this drop-down menu right here, shows us all of the spaces that we have. So this start space, this is only where we are doing the tap to play stuff. Space 1 is the first scene where we have the like sign right here that we're first presented with. Scene 2 is the theater, where there's this gazebo where there used to be a theater, and then space 3 is the church. So essentially what we're doing is when somebody hits the buttons that take you from one scene to another scene, we're going into this loading screen, and let me show you in the Spaces documentary, or not documentary, documentation. It's a really easy method to jump from one space to another. So, oh, let's see. So each space has its ID. I had this, but I lost where it's at. Here, I'll just show it in the project. You basically just say space dot active and then the name of the space. That's how you transition. Needless, like that's the short end of how to do this transition, just because we don't have a lot of time. But it reloads everything inside of the space. So we have space scripts and global scripts. Anything that is blue on this menu right here is going to move between spaces. So to make something persistent is what it's called. You go over here and hit this little button, and it changes it from being persistent to non-persistent and vice versa. So anything that is persistent will move from one space to another. All of the scripts that I wanted to be global are attached to things that are moving. So like all of our audio is a persistent component. All of the UI that is constantly on the screen is a persistent component in our camera. And then everything else, like the functionality of each space, is its own controller. So like the image that pops up is its own thing. The toggles that are appearing are its own thing. All of that data, every single time we go to a new space, that script is rerunning as if it was rerunning for the first time. And then all I'm doing is fading on something to cover the entire screen, making that swap, and then 4 seconds after this fade on is done, it fades off. So we're just kind of covering that swap like magic, and then we're making the scene look at the user again, so that it's centered on the user, so that the user's looking right where we want it to. But yeah, I mean, hopefully some of this was helpful. Spaces is something awesome. I know that George is actually working on a sample project right now that'll demonstrate kind of the core functionality of Spaces. I would highly recommend jumping into the docs and reading about it, and then staying tuned for more sample projects on how Spaces work. But it honestly only took me about 5 to 6 minutes to figure out how to use them and implement them in the project. It was very easy to do, so I would recommend doing it. But we want to make sure we have time for Q&A, so I'm gonna jump off and let Pablo take back over.
Thank you so much, Declan, for that really thorough walkthrough of the code. And I strongly recommend checking out all of Declan's sample projects. You can find them on his profile. Does a really great job of explaining the code. So if you're new to Studio, it's a really good opportunity to learn the basics. But yeah, with that being said, let's move on to some Q&A. The team from Rose Digital is still here, Nicole and Jordan. So if you have any questions regarding the design or how that process was kind of finalized, we can answer those questions as well. But we have a few questions already from mostly all from Libardo in the Q&A that we'll jump into. And I'll try to summarize this into a couple of individual questions, because it seems like, Declan, you answered some of these as you were going. But the first question is, how do you make the transitions that were shown, for example, the adjustment of opacity?
Yeah, for sure. So again, the way that I kind of built the UI of this project was HTML injection, which is not kind of the best practice right now, but it is the one that works the best, in my opinion. So I basically built all of the UI in HTML and then used ChatGPT to convert it to the way that I wanted it to be converted so that I could inject it into the sample project or into the project. And then I was just using CSS animations. So I would fade on the screen like you would with any normal website, just changing the opacity of the CSS through a CSS animation. Once the screen was completely covered, I would change the space so that the user wouldn't see what was going on behind the scenes. And then after a certain set amount of time, it would fade off that HTML. So basically the same way you would do any other website or build any other website with CSS and HTML. That's how that was built. Nothing too complicated.
Cool. And then just to answer Roger's question in the chat, this will be posted later this week as a replay on the Eighth Wall YouTube account. So you'll be able to find it there. And the link is in the chat. Next question, I'm going to jump around a bit here from Libardo because I think this one is super important and something that most will run into is what is Niantic Studio's size limit? Did you feel that the project was getting heavier and slower with the more assets? In this case, you were working with 3 splats. If so, how did you handle that?
That's a good question. So I believe it's the SPZ file type makes splats so much more efficient than they used to be. So everything was an SPZ. All of the splats were SPZs, which kept them. I want to say like the largest file was maybe 12 megs, which is still pretty large for a web AR project, but it's way more manageable now than it used to be. And then all of the UI was just pulled from a lot of it was pulled from Figma's like images. I use tiny PNG to compress everything that I do inside of WebAR because that usually cuts it down to like 70%. And then changing things to JPEGs if they don't need transparency is another thing. So not using PNGs all the time, but I didn't actually notice that things slowed down at all. None of the assets were big enough that it slowed the experience down, but also spaces are really nice because it doesn't load in any of the other assets until you're ready to swap to a new space. So it's kind of like in any other game when you load in assets and you get rid of everything else when you jump from like one scene to another. You're not using all of the textures and all of the assets at the same exact time. Everything is being segmented depending on the space that you're inside of, just like it would in any other video game or gaming engine. And then like there's some general rule of thumbs that are good for if you're using more 3D objects. Like the portal, we did have that one just GLB file inside of the project. The best way to manage anything that's going to be 3D inside of the scene is the textures need to be a power of 2. If it's not a power of 2, then WebGL will automatically convert the texture file from whatever dimensions it is into a power of 2 and then place it as a texture. And that, for a lot of projects, can make or break them. It slows down the project at the beginning and slows down the load time if it has to convert 100 textures to be power of 2. And then there have actually been problems with iPhones over the last couple years. If you have too many files that you are converting at the start of a project, it can cause the project to crash. So just doing your best to make sure that all of your 3D model textures are power of 2 is super important at the start of a project. And then anything over, I want to say, what is it, 2048? Is that what 2K is? Anything above 2K causes it to break on mobile, and you will have a texture that is just black. So I recommend using, if you have to use like the highest resolution you can, 2K is what you can use, but I always recommend using 1024 by 1024 as like your highest resolution for a texture in WebGL, anything that's not just with 8th wall, that's with if you're using A-frame or 3JS, or that's just kind of my what I've noticed as I've worked more with the 3D web in general.
Awesome. Thank you, Declan. The next technical question comes from Leah, who's asking, so Spaces would be the equivalent to WebAR Studio AR scenes?
Yeah. Like I've actually never used WebAR Studio. The best I can compare them to are scenes inside of Unity. So, and then like Godot every game engine has their concept of what a scene or a space is. It's basically just like jumping from one, if you think about it in a video game, like jumping from one level to another level is essentially what jumping between a scene is. It's jumping from, um, like level one in a video game to level two, and you're getting rid of all the level one assets, and now you're only rendering the level two assets. It's just a way to compartmentalize the project. Like I've made fake scenes before, inside of Studio where I have just sectioned off like everything below -50 in the Z is going to be scene one, and then everything at 0 is going to be scene two, and then everything past 50 in the Z is scene three. But now we actually have real sections to separate everything out.
Yeah, awesome. And then we had a question regarding how did we source the historical images for this project? On this front, we used created like pretty much Creative Commons images and images that are publicly available through public domain. So using public searches like the Library of Congress, Oklahoma Public Library, and then commons.wikimedia.org, you can find a lot of these images. Also archive.org is a great resource for that as well. I think that sums up the Q&A we have now, but if anyone has any other questions, you can raise your hand or drop them in the chat before we close out.
Can I add, Pablo? Everybody here should jump on the Discord, and if you have questions, just send me a message on Discord or tag me. I'm very active there. So if you have anything after this that we don't have time to cover, just reach out.
Yeah, I think at this point, Declan is more active on the Discord than I am. There we go. We got a message from Daniel. How can you debug State Machine? And this will be our last question.
Good question. That is something I am still trying to figure out myself. A lot of it is brute force. When I work on projects, I try and segment everything to the best of my ability. So like I will test one functionality and prove out that concept in its own project, and then add it into the final project. So very, very segmented, try out different functionalities until I know that each one of them is working the way that I want, and then building everything from the puzzle pieces. So I'm essentially like building each Lego individually and then building something from all the Legos that I've built. That's my go-to approach for doing it. That works the best, and you can have unlimited projects using Studio. So I would highly recommend you take that approach. And then once you have a Lego piece, share it with everybody else through sample projects. Just a plug for that. But yeah, that's how I typically build a project myself.